My name is Matilda Ford. I am 34 years old. I am the chief of cardiothoracic surgery and the director of the largest medical charity foundation in Michigan. 2 days ago, I sat at the head of a mahogany boardroom table. Across from me sat my parents and my older brother, hands shaking, eyes cast downward. They had come to beg the anonymous foundation director for a $200,000 grant. My father needed a complex bypass surgery to save his life. My brother, drowning in debt, could not afford to help. They had no idea the woman holding their financial survival in her hands was the same daughter they kicked out into a Detroit snowstorm 16 years ago. They threw me away because I was delusional enough to want to be a surgeon. Before I tell you what I slid across that boardroom table, welcome to Eva Tells Stories. Please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you believe that success is the best response to rejection. Drop a comment with your age, your city, and your local time. I love seeing where my listeners are tuning in from. Now let me take you back 16 years to a 10th grade parent-teacher conference. We sat in a cramped high school classroom that smelled of floor wax and old paper. I sat in a hard plastic chair, my hands folded tight in my lap, and finally whispered my dream out loud. I said I wanted to go to medical school. I wanted to be a doctor. My father, a foreman at an auto parts manufacturing plant, let out a booming laugh. The sound echoed down the quiet hallway, harsh and dismissive. He looked at my science teacher and shook his head. A doctor, he repeated, wiping a tear of amusement from his eye. Matilda, let us be realistic. We build things with our hands in this family. My mother, Brenda, nodded in agreement. Her arms were crossed tight against her chest. She told the teacher not to encourage such foolishness. She insisted I needed to focus on finding a shift at the plant packaging car parts, just like my older brother Jason. My teacher, the woman who had praised my biology exams all semester, simply looked down at her desk and said nothing. She let them shrink me. I did not argue. In our house, challenging Thomas Ford was a battle you always lost, but that night I sat alone in my room. I took a cheap paper napkin from the diner where I worked weekend shifts. With a black pen, I wrote one word in capital letters. Doctor. I taped that napkin to the inside of my closet door. Every morning when I reached for my clothes, I saw it. I moved 11 times after that night. From cramped studios to hospital supply closets to a penthouse overlooking the city skyline. That napkin came with me every single time. It became my anchor. Because the storm my parents were preparing to bring down on me was far worse than I could have ever imagined. It would soon cost me every penny I had ever saved. To understand why my family viewed my dreams as a direct threat, you have to understand the culture we grew up in. We lived in a working-class suburb just outside Detroit. It was a neighborhood where success was measured by the calluses on your hands and the grease under your fingernails. The air always smelled faintly of cold exhaust and manufacturing plants. My father, Thomas, was a foreman at a local auto parts facility. He worked grueling shifts and brought the harsh, unforgiving factory floor mentality straight into our living room. He believed that sweat was the only valid currency. My mother, Brenda, was an office administrator at a regional shipping company. She worshipped my father and adopted his worldview as her own personal gospel. In the Ford household, manual labor and an immediate, tangible paycheck were the only respectable paths a person could take. Academic dreams were not just considered unrealistic, they were considered pretentious. To my parents, reading a book meant you were actively avoiding real work. My older brother Jason was the golden child of the family because he fit their mold perfectly. Jason was loud, brash, and wore his disdain for high school like a badge of honor. He had zero interest in college or opening a textbook. He wanted to start his own hauling and landscaping business. To my parents, this was the ultimate achievement. He was going to be a self-made man working with his hands just like his father. Jason could do no wrong. I remember the day he turned 18. The atmosphere in our house felt like a national holiday. I was standing in the kitchen wiping down the counters with a damp rag while my parents led Jason out to the driveway. I watched through the window as they presented his gift. Gleaming under the gray Michigan sky was a brand new heavy-duty Ford F-150. It was not a used vehicle. It was top of the line, pristine and powerful. I later discovered that my parents had taken out a second mortgage on our family home to buy that truck. They leveraged their own shelter, their financial security to fund his business before he even had a single paying client. Jason tossed the keys in the air, caught them, and smirked at me through the kitchen window glass. He knew he was the king of the castle. Meanwhile, my existence in that house was entirely different. I was treated as the live-in maid. My daily routine was punishing. My mornings began at 5 o'clock sharp. While Jason slept until noon in his comfortable bedroom, I was on my hands and knees scrubbing the linoleum kitchen floors. I was responsible for washing his stained work clothes. I stood over the utility sink in the laundry room for hours, scrubbing motor oil and thick grass stains out of his heavy denim pants, my knuckles cracking and bleeding in the harsh winter air. I packed his lunches. I brewed my father's coffee. I prepared my mother's breakfast. If I missed a single spot on the counter or forgot to fold Jason's shirts exactly the way he liked them, my mother would call me back downstairs and stand over me until I corrected the mistake. By the time I finally left the house for school, my body was already exhausted. I did not receive a vehicle for my birthday. I did not even get a ride to campus. I had to walk 4 blocks in the freezing, biting Detroit winter wind to catch the public transit bus to high school. I would sit in the very back row of the rattling bus, shivering in my thin winter coat, my fingers numb as I tried to review flashcards for my advanced placement classes. The other kids talked and laughed, but I just stared at my notes, desperate to memorize chemical bonds and cellular structures before the first bell rang. The conflict in our house was not simply that my parents did not believe in my dreams. The true issue was that my ambition offended them. They viewed my desire to become a surgeon as an insult to their entire way of life. When I brought home report cards with perfect grades, they were met with eye rolls or ignored entirely. But the active sabotage was much worse than the neglect. My advanced placement biology and chemistry textbooks were heavy and expensive. I purchased them myself using my own hard-earned money. I would try to study at the kitchen table in the evenings, but only after I had cleared away their dinner dishes and wiped down the surfaces. One evening, my father walked into the kitchen holding a beer. He looked down at my anatomy textbook spread open across the table. He did not ask what I was studying. He did not care about the hours I had spent highlighting the circulatory system. He just swung his heavy arm across the wood, knocking my textbook, my notebooks, and my pens onto the floor. The thick spine of the book cracked loudly against the tile. The pages bent and crumpled. I froze, staring at my ruined work. My father looked down at me with pure disdain. He said my books were taking up too much space. He told me the kitchen was a place for eating, not a place for pretending I was better than the rest of the family. He ordered me to pick up my mess and find somewhere else to waste my time. I learned very quickly that my survival depended on making my ambitions invisible. I gathered my damaged books and started studying in my bedroom, but even that was not safe. My mother would patrol the hallway at night, checking the crack under my bedroom door. If she saw the light on past 10 o'clock, she would barge into the room and demand I turn it off. She claimed I was wasting electricity and being inconsiderate of the people who actually had to work for a living. So I adapted to the darkness. I bought a small battery-powered flashlight from the hardware store. Every night I would pull my thin blanket over my head, creating a tiny, suffocating tent of light. I read about cardiovascular systems and neurological pathways while sweating under the cheap fabric. I strained my eyes in the dim beam of the flashlight, struggling to focus while listening to Jason play video games at top volume in the room right next door. Nobody ever told him to turn his screens off. On weekends, I worked double shifts at a local diner to fund my escape. The diner was greasy, loud, and demanding. I poured endless cups of black coffee, wiped down sticky vinyl booths, and carried heavy trays of pancakes and burgers until my shoulders ached and my feet blistered. I smiled at the customers and swallowed my exhaustion. Every single dollar I earned in tips went straight into a joint savings account. My mother had opened that account for me when I was 14, requiring her name on the paperwork because I was a minor. I trusted that the bank was a safe place. I watched the balance grow slowly, deposit by deposit, shift by shift. I needed that money for college application fees and future tuition. It was my lifeline. I spent my entire senior year secretly applying to pre-medical programs. I filled out the lengthy applications during my short lunch breaks at the high school library. I paid the application fees using cash and money orders so the transactions would never show up on any statements mailed to the house. I operated like a ghost, keeping my head down, doing the chores, and hiding my future. I harbored a quiet, desperate hope in my chest. I genuinely thought that if I could just get the acceptance letter in my hands, everything would shift. I thought if I could present them with physical, undeniable proof that a prestigious university wanted me, they would wake up. I believed that holding official university letterhead would finally make my father look at me with pride. I thought it would make my mother realize I was capable of greatness. I thought they would finally see my worth and support my journey. I was dead wrong. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late April. The Michigan air still held a bitter chill, the kind that bites through a thin denim jacket, but I did not feel the cold when I pulled that thick white envelope from our dented metal mailbox. The return address bore the navy blue crest of the University of Michigan. It was heavy. Rejection letters are always thin, just a single sheet of polite dismissal. A heavy envelope meant paperwork. It meant a future. I stood on the cracked concrete of our driveway and tore the seal. The very first word on the heavy cardstock was congratulations. I had been accepted into their highly competitive pre-medical track. Pinned behind the welcome letter was a financial aid summary. The university was offering a partial academic scholarship based on my grade point average and standardized test scores. It covered a significant portion of the tuition, but there was still a gap. The remaining balance to cover my freshman year was exactly $5,000. I smiled until my cheeks ached. That number did not frighten me. It was a hurdle I had already cleared. For 3 grueling years, I had worked every single weekend at a roadside diner called the Copper Griddle. While my high school classmates attended football games and basement parties, I spent my Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays wiping down sticky vinyl booths, pouring endless refills of black coffee, and carrying heavy ceramic plates until my wrists throbbed and my feet went numb. I went home every night smelling of stale frying oil and bleach. Every dollar I earned, every crumpled $5 bill left under a coffee cup, every handful of silver coins went straight into a savings account. Because I was only 14, when I secured my first under-the-table busboy shift, I could not open a bank account in my own name. The state required a legal adult to be on the paperwork. My mother had driven me to the local credit union, signed the dotted line, and handed me the deposit booklet. I trusted her. Why would a child not trust her own mother to hold the key to her future? Over 3 years, I had religiously deposited my earnings. I tracked the numbers in a spiral notebook hidden under my mattress. As of my last deposit, the balance sat at $5,414.50. I had the money. My escape route was fully funded. The next morning, I skipped my first period study hall and took the city transit bus down to the credit union. I walked through the glass double doors, feeling a profound sense of pride. I approached the teller counter, pulled my worn deposit booklet from my backpack, and slid it across the marble surface. I asked the woman behind the glass to draft a cashier's check for $5,000 made payable to the University of Michigan. The teller smiled a warm and encouraging expression and began typing my account number into her computer. I watched her eyes scan the screen. I saw the exact moment her smile faltered. Her hand stopped moving over the keyboard. She leaned closer to her monitor, her brow furrowing in confusion. Then she looked up at me with an expression of deep, unsettling pity. "I am sorry, sweetie," she said softly. "I cannot draft a check for that amount. The balance in this account is $14.50. The lobby spun. The ambient noise of the bank faded into a high-pitched ringing in my ears. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. I told her there had to be a mistake. I explained that I had been depositing money every single week for 3 years. I practically begged her to refresh the screen to check the routing numbers again. She turned her monitor slightly so I could see the glowing text. She printed a ledger statement and slid the paper across the counter. There it was in stark black ink. A single devastating line item dated 3 weeks prior. A withdrawal of $5,400. The transaction was authorized in person at this very branch. The signature on the withdrawal slip belonged to Brenda Ford. I grabbed the printed statement and stumbled out of the bank. The cold air hit my face, but I felt nothing but a blinding, suffocating rage. The pieces of the past month suddenly clicked into a horrifying alignment. 3 weeks ago, my brother Jason had stopped driving his precious heavy-duty Ford truck. He had been unusually quiet, sullen, taking the bus or asking my father for rides to his landscaping jobs. When I had asked my parents where the truck was, my father had snapped at me to mind my own business. Now the truth was laid out in my shaking hands. My mother had emptied my account. She had stolen my blood, sweat, and blistered feet. I did not wait for the bus. I ran the 2 miles back to our neighborhood. My lungs burned. My throat felt raw, but the adrenaline fueled every step. I burst through the front door of our house, the hinges groaning in protest. The television was blaring a daytime talk show in the living room. My mother was sitting on the floral sofa, her feet propped up on the coffee table, leisurely applying a fresh coat of pink polish to her fingernails. I marched into the room and slammed the bank statement down on the glass table right next to her bottles of polish. The sound made her jump. She looked up, annoyed by the interruption. "Where is my college money?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a rage I had never allowed myself to express in that house. Brenda looked at the paper. She did not gasp. She did not look guilty. She did not even blink. She slowly capped her nail polish, set it down, and met my gaze with chilling indifference. "Jason got a driving under the influence charge," she said flatly. "He wrecked his truck into a median. The police arrested him. We had to pay to get his truck out of the impound lot, and he needed a retainer for a defense attorney to keep his landscaping business afloat and keep him out of jail." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, waiting for her to say they would pay it back, waiting for any sign of maternal regret. Nothing came. She spoke about taking my life savings as if she had simply borrowed a cup of sugar from the pantry. "You stole my future," I whispered, the reality suffocating me. "I earned that money for medical school. I got accepted today. I have the letter. I need that money to secure my spot." My mother picked up a nail file and returned to her manicure. "Family comes first, Matilda," she recited, delivering the phrase like a weapon. "Your brother made a mistake and he needed our help. You have a roof over your head and food on your plate. You can find another way to pay for your little doctor fantasy. Jason is building a real business. We had to protect his livelihood." The sheer audacity of her rationalization broke whatever restraint I had left. She had not just stolen my money. She had sacrificed my entire existence to erase her golden child's criminal mistake. My future was the collateral damage of his reckless behavior. I stood in that living room and unleashed a scream of raw, agonizing betrayal. I shouted that she had ruined my life. I shouted that Jason was a failure who was dragging them all down. I yelled that they never cared about me, that they only viewed me as an asset to be stripped and discarded whenever the favorite son needed a bailout. The volume of my despair echoed through the small house. My mother finally stood up, her face twisting into a scowl of deep offense. She opened her mouth to put me in my place, but a shadow fell over the living room archway. The heavy, unmistakable thud of steel-toed work boots echoed against the hardwood floor. My father had just returned home from his shift at the plant. He stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the exit, his face dark with fury, as he took in the scene of his daughter daring to challenge the hierarchy of his home. My father stood in the archway of the living room. His heavy steel-toed boots tracked gray slush onto the hardwood floor, leaving dirty puddles against the baseboards. He smelled of industrial lubricants, cold sweat, and stale cigarette smoke. He took in the scene before him, processing the sight of his daughter daring to raise her voice to his wife. He did not ask why I was crying. He did not ask why my face was flushed with panic. His eyes darted to the bank statement lying on the glass table, then back to my tear-streaked cheeks. His expression hardened into a familiar mask of contempt. "Don't you dare raise your voice to your mother over money," he barked. His tone was sharp enough to rattle the picture frames on the walls. He took a heavy step into the room, his physical presence designed to intimidate. I refused to shrink. I held up the thick cardstock of my college acceptance letter. My hands were shaking so hard the paper fluttered in the quiet air. I pleaded with him. I explained the scholarship offer. I explained the grueling weekend shifts at the diner. I explained the $14.50 remaining in my account. I begged him to understand that this was my only chance to build a life beyond the assembly line. I told him I had earned every single penny of that stolen fund and that I just needed it back to secure my spot at the university. My father did not flinch. He stepped closer, his jaw locked. He reached out and snatched the thick envelope from my trembling fingers. I watched in slow motion as his calloused, grease-stained hands clamped down on the university seal. He did not even bother to read the words offering me a future. He simply crushed the heavy paper in his fist. The sound of the thick cardstock tearing and folding echoed in the silent living room. He threw the ruined ball of paper into the plastic trash can by the sofa. "I am sick of this doctor fantasy," he sneered, looking down at me as if I were a stranger who had insulted him. "You think you are better than us. You think reading a few books makes you special. Let us talk about reality, Matilda. Jason is actually building something real. He works with his hands. He owns a business." I stared at him, my vision blurring with fresh tears. "Jason drove a truck into a median because he was intoxicated," I cried out. "He is a criminal who bankrupted my future." My father took another step forward, closing the distance between us, until I had to tilt my head back to meet his furious gaze. "Jason is a provider who hit a rough patch," he stated, "rewriting history to protect the golden child. We are a family. We pool our resources to protect our own. Your mother did what was necessary to save your brother from a rigged legal system, and you are going to do your part." He did not just defend the theft, he doubled down. He delivered the ultimatum that would split my life into a before and an after. "You have two choices," my father said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You can drop this university nonsense today. You will take the open packaging shift at the auto parts plant starting Monday morning. You will hand your paychecks over to your mother to help pay down Jason's legal fees and keep his landscaping crew operating. You will do real work for once in your life, or you can get out of my house." The room grew suffocatingly quiet. I was 18 years old. I had $14 to my name. I had no vehicle, no winter boots capable of surviving a Detroit freeze, and no safety net. I looked at my mother. She was picking at a loose thread on her sweater, entirely unfazed by the fact that her husband was threatening to throw her teenage daughter onto the streets. I realized in that exact moment that staying meant slow suffocation. If I accepted the shift at the plant, they would bleed me dry forever. They would take my wages to fund Jason's mistakes until I was hollowed out bitter and trapped in a life I despised. The choice was terrifying, but it was surprisingly easy. I did not say another word. I turned my back on my parents and walked down the short hallway to my cramped bedroom. I pulled a faded canvas duffel bag from under my bed. I packed only what I had purchased myself. I took 3 pairs of jeans, a handful of plain shirts, thick wool socks, and my toothbrush. I left behind the cheap sweaters they had bought me for Christmas. I left behind the bedding. I wanted nothing that tied me to their conditional charity. Before zipping the bag closed, I turned to the closet door. Taped to the inside panel was the cheap paper napkin from the diner. The word "doctor" was written across it in faded black ink. I carefully peeled the tape away from the wood, making sure not to tear the fragile paper. I folded the napkin and tucked it safely into the front pocket of my jacket. It was the only piece of my future I had left. I slung the duffel bag over my shoulder and walked back out into the living room. Jason had emerged from his bedroom. He was sitting on the floral sofa, a video game controller in his hands, staring blankly at the television screen. The glow of the digital explosions illuminated his face. He did not even pause his game when I walked past. He just offered a lazy, triumphant smirk. He knew he had won. My mother watched me with cold indifference. My father crossed his arms over his chest, his posture rigid. They fully expected me to realize the harsh reality of the outside world, turn around and beg for my job at the plant. They thought poverty would break my spirit within a week. I reached the front door, turned the deadbolt, and pulled it open. A brutal Michigan November snowstorm was raging outside. The wind howled, driving thick sheets of white snow across the porch. The temperature was already dropping below freezing. I stepped out into the biting cold and pulled the door shut behind me. The heavy click of the latch severed my ties to the Ford family forever. The freezing wind cut through my thin denim jacket instantly. My sneakers offered zero protection against the accumulating slush. I kept my head down and started walking. Every step was an agony of cold and grief, but I did not stop. I knew I could not stay in the open elements without freezing to death. I walked 2 miles through the blinding whiteout conditions, my teeth chattering so violently my jaw ached. I navigated the icy sidewalks until I reached a small, rundown apartment complex where my diner coworker Maya lived. Maya was a kind, exhausted waitress who worked the morning shifts. I knew she parked her rusted Ford Taurus in the back alley. The locks on her back doors were broken. She had complained about it during our shifts, joking that no one would want to steal a car that barely ran. I found the sedan buried under a layer of fresh snow. I pulled the rear handle and the door creaked open. The interior smelled of old fast food and stale coffee. I climbed into the back seat, pulled my duffel bag onto my lap, and slammed the door shut against the howling wind. The vinyl seats were like slabs of ice. I curled into the tightest ball I could manage, wrapping my arms around my bag to preserve whatever body heat I had left. I spent my first night as an adult sleeping in the back of that frozen, rusted car. The temperature continued to plummet. My breath plumed in the dark, icy air of the cabin. I shivered uncontrollably, my muscles cramping from the cold. But every time I felt the urge to cry, every time the panic threatened to swallow me whole, I pressed my numb hand against the front pocket of my jacket. I could feel the thin paper of the diner napkin resting against my chest. I clutched it like a shield. I told myself that the freezing night would end. The dawn would break. And when the sun came up, I would figure out how to survive. I had to survive. Because the alternative was going back to a house where I was nothing more than fuel to keep someone else warm. Rock bottom possesses a distinct and unforgiving aroma. For me, it smelled like industrial-grade bleach, mixed with sterile alcohol and stale cafeteria coffee. My escape from the frozen back seat of Maya's rusted sedan led me directly into the punishing reality of systemic poverty. I could not afford the pristine brick dormitories on the university campus. Instead, I found a cramped, roach-infested studio apartment situated above a noisy commercial laundromat. I shared that single room with 3 other young women who were also drowning in the margins of society. We slept on thin mattresses placed directly on the sagging floorboards. Our belongings stayed packed in boxes to prevent the pests from ruining our few possessions. Privacy was a luxury none of us could afford. Every morning I woke up to the sound of industrial washing machines vibrating the floor beneath me. Yet the squalor of that tiny apartment was preferable to the pristine silence of my childhood home. At least here the suffering belonged to me. It was a choice I made for my own future rather than a sacrifice demanded by my parents. To pay my share of the rent and cover the remaining gap in my tuition, I had to secure employment that fit around a rigorous pre-medical class schedule. The only position available was a nocturnal one. I became an overnight custodian at a local hospital. My shift started at 11 at night and ended at 7 in the morning. While my university peers were attending fraternity mixers or sleeping comfortably in climate-controlled dorms, I was wearing a shapeless gray uniform, pushing a heavy yellow mop bucket down sterile white corridors. The labor was visceral and relentless. I scrubbed operating room floors after trauma surgeries, removing the physical remnants of frantic life-saving procedures. I tied off heavy red biohazard bags and hauled them down to the incinerator rooms. I sanitized emergency department waiting areas where sick and terrified people had sat hours earlier. The physical toll was intense. My shoulders ached permanently, and my hands developed rough calluses from the harsh cleaning chemicals. My father had always insisted that manual labor was the only honorable way to make a living. He claimed I thought I was too good to get my hands dirty. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. I was doing manual labor every single night, but I was using the sweat of my brow to fund the exact academic dream he had ridiculed. When my shift ended at 7 in the morning, the real trial began. I did not have the luxury of returning to my mattress on the floor to sleep. Instead, I would step into the harsh fluorescent light of the staff locker room. I would strip off my uniform, wash my face in the cold metal sink, and change into my civilian clothes. I splashed freezing water on my eyes to force myself awake. From the hospital, I walked straight to the university campus to attend my organic chemistry and cellular biology lectures. I sat in large auditorium seating surrounded by rested, well-fed students who took their stability for granted. They complained about the dining hall food or the difficulty of the reading assignments. I sat quietly in the back row, fighting a constant war against my own biology. I existed on a maximum of 3 hours of sleep a day. My diet consisted primarily of discarded cafeteria leftovers that the hospital kitchen staff kindly set aside for me, or 50-cent instant noodles heated in a microwave. My stomach constantly rumbled during exams, but I trained myself to ignore the hunger. I viewed my exhaustion as a tax I had to pay to access a world that was designed to keep people like me out. But I did not just survive that custodial job, I utilized it. The hospital became my unofficial classroom. While pushing my mop bucket past the surgical wings, I watched the attending physicians. I observed their posture, their urgency, and the way they commanded a room. I memorized the exact layout of the surgical suites, learning where every piece of life-saving equipment was stored. When the night shift slowed down around 3 in the morning, I would retreat to a designated supply closet on the 3rd floor. Sitting on an overturned bucket surrounded by boxes of saline solution and sterile gauze, I pulled out my flashcards. I memorized complex anatomical structures and chemical equations in the dim light of that closet. I kept the faded diner napkin with the word doctor written on it folded safely inside my locker. On the nights when my body felt too heavy to move, when the stinging scent of bleach brought tears to my eyes, I would look at that napkin. It reminded me that the pain was temporary, but the goal was permanent. I was a ghost moving through the pristine halls of healing, preparing to eventually take my rightful place among the elite surgeons I cleaned up after. During those long months of silent grinding, I heard nothing from my biological family. My parents never called to see if I had survived the winter. They never reached out to verify if I had a roof over my head or food to eat. It was as if the moment the front door clicked shut behind me, I ceased to exist in their reality. They had successfully discarded the defective child. Through the cruel grapevine of social media and mutual acquaintances from my old hometown, I received unwanted updates about their lives. Jason had managed to avoid serious jail time for his reckless driving incident thanks to the funds my mother had stolen from my savings account. In fact, his hauling and landscaping business was experiencing a sudden surge in clients. He had hired a crew of workers and purchased new equipment. My parents were reportedly boasting about his expanding empire to anyone who would listen at their local church and grocery store. They painted a picture of a triumphant, self-made son who was the pride of the Ford family. In their narrative, I was the ungrateful dropout who had run away because I was too lazy to contribute to the household. I swallowed the bitter taste of that injustice. I let the anger metabolize into raw motivation. Let them brag about his lawnmowers, I told myself while scrubbing blood off a surgical table. I am building something they cannot even comprehend. By the spring semester of my sophomore year, I truly believed the hardest part of my journey was over. I was maintaining a flawless grade point average despite my punishing schedule. The hospital custodial staff had become a strange makeshift support system. The nurses brought me extra coffee, and the security guards made sure I walked safely to campus in the early morning light. I had forged a fragile but functional stability. I had proven that I could survive without my parents' money, without their shelter, and without their conditional love. I thought my ties to Thomas and Brenda Ford were severed permanently. I thought I had outrun their control. But escaping poverty is rarely a simple sprint to the finish line. The system is designed with invisible tripwires meant to pull vulnerable people back into the cycle of generational struggle. My parents still held one crucial piece of leverage over my life. They possessed a legal authority I had not anticipated needing. The bureaucratic machinery of higher education was about to hand my father the very weapon he needed to drag me back down to his level. I was about to learn that walking away was only the first battle. The real war was going to require tearing up the rulebook entirely. By the spring semester of my sophomore year, I was holding on to a 3.9 grade point average. I was perpetually exhausted, running on fumes and sheer willpower, but I had finally found my rhythm. The hospital custodial job paid my rent, and the cafeteria leftovers kept me fed. My academic scholarship covered the bulk of my tuition, and federal student loans bridged the remaining gap. I had built a precarious, delicate ecosystem of survival balancing on a razor's edge. I felt a tentative sense of victory. I was actually doing it. I was becoming the person my parents swore I could never be. Then the financial aid office sent an urgent email. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read the subject line, "Action required missing FAFSA documentation." I hurried to the administration building between my biology and chemistry lectures. A weary financial aid counselor handed me a printed form. To continue receiving my federal Pell Grants and the subsidized student loans that kept me enrolled, the government required my parents' most recent tax returns. I explained my situation to the counselor. I told her I was estranged from my family. I told her I paid all my own bills and lived entirely independently. She offered a sympathetic but rigid smile. The bureaucratic machinery of higher education is unyielding. Because I was under the age of 24, the federal government legally considered me a dependent student. It did not matter that my parents had thrown me out into a blizzard. It did not matter that they had stolen my savings. Unless I was married an active duty member of the military or an emancipated orphan, I needed Thomas and Brenda Ford to sign that paperwork and provide their W-2 forms. Without those documents, my federal aid would be immediately revoked. Without that aid, I would not be able to register for junior year. My entire carefully constructed life would collapse. I sat on a concrete bench outside the administration building, staring at the financial aid form. For 2 years, I had maintained total silence. I had not called them on holidays. I had not sent a single message. Now the system was forcing me to break that silence. I had to ask my abusers for a favor. I swallowed my pride, pulled out my cheap prepaid cell phone, and dialed the number I had tried so hard to forget. The phone rang 4 times. My chest was tight. "Hello," my father's voice boomed through the receiver. He sounded exactly the same, loud, arrogant, accustomed to obedience. "Dad, it is Matilda," I said, keeping my voice as level as possible. There was a pause. I could hear the television blaring in the background. "Matilda," he said, drawing out the syllables. "Calling after all this time. Let me guess. The real world got too tough for you. You need money." "I don't need your money," I replied quickly, desperate to maintain my footing. "I need a signature. It is for my financial aid application. I just need you and Mom to provide a copy of your tax transcript and sign the FAFSA form. It will not cost you a single dime. You are not co-signing a loan. You are just verifying your income so the government will release my grants." My father let out a low, rumbling chuckle, a sound that had always preceded a punishment. "You want us to do you a favor," he said slowly. "You run away from your responsibilities to this family, you turn your back on your own brother, and now you want our help so you can keep playing pretend at the university." I gripped the phone tighter. "Please, Dad. If I don't get this paperwork submitted in 48 hours, the university will unenroll me. I will lose everything I have worked for." I heard the rustle of movement. I heard him call out to my mother. "Brenda, turn the TV down. The runaway is on the phone. She needs a favor." A moment later, my father's voice returned sharper this time. "We will sign your little form," he said. Under one condition. Relief flared in my chest for a fraction of a second before his next sentence extinguished it entirely. Jason needs a new commercial wood chipper and a heavy-duty flatbed trailer, my father announced. He has been expanding the business, taking on bigger commercial accounts. But he hit a snag with the bank. He needs a co-signer for a business equipment loan. My blood ran cold. Jason had already destroyed his own credit score. He had already blown through the $5,000 my mother had stolen from me. Now they wanted me to leverage my pristine, hard-earned student credit to fund his failing landscaping business. "You want me to co-sign a loan for Jason?" I asked, my voice rising in disbelief. "It is just a formality," my father insisted, though his tone was defensive. "Jason will make the payments. His business is booming. The bank just needs a second signature because of that misunderstanding with his DUI a few years ago. You have good credit now from those student loans. You owe this family Matilda. You owe your brother. If I co-sign a commercial equipment loan and he defaults, I will be legally responsible for tens of thousands of dollars in debt," I pleaded. "It will ruin my credit. It will destroy my chances of ever getting medical school loans. I cannot do that." My father's patience evaporated. He dropped the pretense of negotiation. "Then figure out your own financial aid, doctor," he mocked, spitting the title like a curse word. "You want to be so independent? Be independent. Don't call this house again unless you are ready to sign that loan document." The line went dead. The dial tone buzzed in my ear. I lowered the phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The sheer malice of their demand paralyzed me. They were actively holding my education hostage. They were weaponizing a federal bureaucratic loophole to force me into financial servitude. They knew I was desperate. They knew my entire future hung on that single signature. They were willing to watch me lose everything if I refused to sacrifice myself for their golden child. I had 48 hours to provide the documents, 48 hours before the financial aid office purged my enrollment status. That night, I went to work at the hospital. I pushed my mop bucket down the sterile corridors, my vision blurred by unshed tears. The heavy scent of industrial bleach usually grounded me, but tonight it just made me nauseous. I scrubbed the floors of the operating rooms, moving mechanically. The dream I had fought so hard for was evaporating. I had survived the freezing snowstorm. I had survived the exhaustion. I had survived the hunger. But I could not survive the legal requirement of their signature. Around 3 a.m, the hospital grew quiet. The frantic energy of the emergency room settled into a low hum. I retreated to my designated supply closet on the 3rd floor. It was a narrow, windowless space filled with boxes of saline stacks of sterile gauze and the pungent smell of antiseptic wipes. I pulled the heavy door shut behind me, locking myself in the dark. I sank to the floor, my back sliding against the cool tile wall. I pulled my knees to my chest and finally broke. The silent, stoic facade I had maintained for 2 years shattered. I wept into my hands, the sound muffled by the thick concrete walls. I was mourning the loss of my future. I was mourning the agonizing realization that my parents truly hated me. They did not just favor Jason, they actively wanted me to fail so they could feel justified in their contempt. I felt entirely, hopelessly trapped. I was a ghost haunting the halls of a hospital, scrubbing floors for doctors I would never become. The systemic traps of American poverty had finally closed their steel jaws around me, and my own parents had pulled the lever. I sat in that supply closet surrounded by mops, completely broken. I was sitting on the cold linoleum floor of that 3rd-floor supply closet. The heavy scent of antiseptic usually grounded me during my overnight shifts, but tonight it only deepened my nausea. My head rested against a towering stack of surgical masks. I was crying so hard, my chest ached, the kind of ragged, desperate sobs that tear through you when you realize every exit has been bricked over. The 48-hour deadline from the University Financial Aid Office felt like a physical weight crushing my lungs. My parents had won. They had successfully weaponized the federal government's dependency rules to force me into funding Jason's failing landscaping business. I was a janitor who had dared to dream of becoming a surgeon, and now the system was putting me back in my place. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door of the supply closet swung open. The harsh fluorescent light from the corridor spilled over me, illuminating my tear-streaked face and the advanced anatomy textbook resting in my lap. I scrambled to wipe my eyes with the rough sleeve of my gray uniform, terrified that I was about to be fired for hiding during my shift. Standing in the doorway was Dr. Sylvia Bennett. Everyone in the hospital knew who she was. She was the formidable, razor-sharp chief of surgery. She possessed a reputation for demanding absolute perfection and was known to make arrogant surgical residents cry during morning rounds. She stood there in her pristine white coat, a stethoscope draped around her neck, her piercing brown eyes analyzing the scene. She looked from my mop bucket to my swollen eyes, and finally, her gaze locked onto the heavy, expensive medical textbook. "What are you doing with that book?" she asked. Her voice was not angry. It was sharp, inquisitive, and completely stripped of pity. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the textbook to my chest like a shield. I tried to formulate an apology, to invent an excuse about taking a break, but the exhaustion had stripped away my defenses. The words spilled out in a rushed, frantic confession. I told her about the stolen college savings account. I told her about the brutal ultimatum that forced me into the snowstorm. I described the grueling nocturnal shifts, the 3 hours of sleep, and the cafeteria leftovers. Finally, I explained the devastating phone call I had just received from my father. I detailed the impossible choice he had presented: co-sign a massive commercial loan for my brother, or lose the financial aid, keeping me enrolled in my pre-medical program. Dr. Bennett did not offer me a sympathetic hug. She did not tell me that everything happens for a reason, the hollow platitude people offer when they want to quickly escape someone else's suffering. Instead, her expression hardened into a look of fierce tactical calculation. She saw a systemic problem that required a systemic solution. "Put the mop away, Matilda," she commanded, glancing at her watch. "Your shift is over. Follow me." She turned on her heel and marched down the corridor. I trailed behind her, my heart hammering against my ribs. Dr. Bennett bypassed the surgical wings entirely. She led me straight down to the ground floor, navigating the labyrinth of administrative offices until we reached the hospital's clinical social work department. She pushed open the door of the lead social worker's office without knocking. Dr. Bennett spent the next hour detailing my situation to the social worker with the precision of a surgeon outlining a complex operation. They spoke about bureaucratic loopholes, federal guidelines, and protective protocols. That morning, I was introduced to a term that would ultimately save my life: a dependency override. Dr. Bennett explained that the Department of Education allows financial aid administrators to override the standard dependency status for students facing extreme, documented parental alienation, abuse, or abandonment. I did not have to remain a hostage to my parents' tax returns. I could legally sever myself from their financial household, allowing me to qualify for maximum federal grants and loans entirely on my own merit. However, the process was intentionally grueling. The government required an overwhelming burden of proof to ensure students were not simply trying to bypass parental income contributions. I had to build a watertight legal case against Thomas and Brenda Ford. Over the next 3 months, Dr. Bennett transformed from a passing savior into my most ferocious advocate. She did not just point me in the right direction, she walked alongside me through the fire. She helped me secure pro bono legal counsel through the hospital's advocacy network. Together, we gathered the necessary documentation. I obtained the bank records, showing my mother's unauthorized withdrawal of my life savings. I requested the police dispatch log from the night they attempted to declare me a runaway when I was 16. The most difficult requirement was securing third-party affidavits sworn under penalty of perjury attesting to the abuse and abandonment. Dr. Bennett wrote a devastatingly clear letter documenting my physical exhaustion and the extreme measures I had taken to survive while working the overnight shifts. The social worker compiled a detailed psychological assessment outlining the coercive control my parents utilized to manipulate my future. We even tracked down Maya, my old diner coworker, whose rusted car had sheltered me during that first blizzard, and she provided a notarized statement regarding my sudden homelessness. We submitted a thick, undeniable binder of evidence to the university's financial aid review committee. The waiting period was agonizing. Every time my phone buzzed, my pulse spiked, fearing it was a rejection notice that would seal my fate. But Dr. Bennett kept me focused. She invited me to shadow her during her morning rounds. I traded my gray custodial uniform for borrowed scrubs. I stood quietly in the back of operating rooms, watching her execute complex cardiac procedures with breathtaking calm. She quizzed me on anatomy between surgeries, treating me not as a charity case, but as a future colleague. She showed me what a parent is actually supposed to look like. Not someone who drains your resources to keep a favored child afloat, but someone who leverages their own power to elevate you. The official letter from the university arrived in mid-July. The Financial Aid Review Board had reviewed my comprehensive dossier. They ruled unanimously in my favor. My dependency override was officially approved. The decision effectively severed my financial ties to my parents. I was reclassified as an independent student with zero expected family contribution. My financial aid package was recalculated instantly, unlocking maximum federal Pell Grant subsidized loans and additional institutional need-based scholarships. My junior and senior years of tuition were fully covered. The threat of unenrollment evaporated. I sat in Dr. Bennett's office holding the approval letter, tears streaming down my face. This time they were tears of profound relief. I had defeated the trap. I had legally proven my independence. Thomas and Brenda Ford had lost their final piece of leverage. I no longer needed their signatures, their money, or their permission to exist. I funneled that overwhelming gratitude directly into my studies. I quit the overnight custodial job, utilizing my new financial stability to secure a position as a research assistant in the university's cardiovascular lab. I immersed myself in the grueling reality of medical school preparation. I shadowed Dr. Bennett, tirelessly absorbing every lesson she offered. I scored in the 99th percentile on my medical college admission test. The silence from my biological family remained absolute. I later learned through a mutual acquaintance that my father had been furious when the financial aid deadline passed, and I had not called to beg for his signature. They assumed I had dropped out and slunk away in defeat. They continued to spin a narrative to their neighbors and extended relatives, claiming I was a troubled failure who had abandoned the family because I could not handle the pressure of real work. I never bothered to correct them. Their delusion was irrelevant. I was too busy building the foundation of an empire they could not even comprehend. But outrunning your past does not erase it. The trauma of that systemic abuse leaves deep, invisible scars that shape the trajectory of your entire career. The independence I fought so hard to secure came with an isolating price tag. I was about to enter the most challenging academic environment in the country, completely untethered from any biological support system. The true test of my resilience was only just beginning. 4 years after I walked out of my childhood home into a blinding Michigan snowstorm, the email arrived. It was a Tuesday evening in late spring. The harsh winter frost had finally thawed, leaving the city streets damp and reflecting the amber glow of the streetlights. I was sitting at a chipped particle board desk in my cramped studio apartment, staring at my laptop screen. My eyes burned from hours of reviewing biochemistry notes. The notification chime echoed in the quiet room. The sender address bore the domain of one of the top-tier medical institutions in the country. I held my breath and clicked the subject line. The text loaded slowly over my unstable internet connection. The first word I saw was "Congratulations." The paragraphs that followed detailed my acceptance into their incoming medical school class. But it was the second page of the attached document that made my heart stop beating. The financial aid summary outlined a full-ride merit scholarship. It covered every cent of the exorbitant tuition, the laboratory fees, and even provided a modest living stipend. The crushing burden of taking on hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical school loans evaporated in a single instant. The admissions committee had reviewed my flawless grade point average, my top percentile test scores, and the grueling reality of my background. They recognized my grit. They chose to invest in my future. I sat back in my mismatched desk chair, the glow of the screen illuminating the tear tracks on my face. I was 22 years old. I had just achieved the impossible. I had reached the summit of a mountain my own parents swore I could never climb. The natural human instinct in a moment of profound triumph is to reach for your phone. You want to call the people who brought you into this world. You want to hear your father tell you he is proud. You want to hear your mother weep with joy. You want to see their celebratory posts on social media boasting to their friends and extended relatives about their brilliant daughter. I picked up my cheap, prepaid cell phone. The screen remained dark. I had no biological family to call. There would be no reservations made at a fine dining restaurant to celebrate my success. There would be no graduation gifts, no framed photographs, no proud parents clapping in the audience. If I dialed the number to the house in that working-class suburb, Thomas and Brenda Ford would likely hang up the moment they recognized my voice. They were too busy funding Jason's chaotic life, pretending their daughter had simply vanished into failure. The silence in my tiny apartment was heavy. Achieving your wildest dream while possessing no one to share it with is a very specific type of grief. It hollows you out. I wiped my face, closed my laptop, and put on my shapeless gray uniform. I had one final shift at the hospital. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the medical center just before 11 at night. The familiar scent of industrial cleaner and sterile alcohol wrapped around me. I reported to the custodial staging area to retrieve my mop bucket and supply cart. I fully expected to spend my final 8 hours in quiet reflection, wiping down the emergency room waiting areas and emptying biohazard bins, slipping out the back door at dawn without a sound. I pushed my cart down the long fluorescent lit corridor toward the staff break room to grab my assigned floor schedule. I pushed the heavy wooden door open. The lights flipped on. A cheer erupted, bouncing off the linoleum walls. I froze in the doorway, my hands gripping the handle of my cart. The break room was packed. Standing there was Dr. Sylvia Bennett, still wearing her white coat, her stethoscope draped around her neck. Surrounding her were the night shift triage nurses, the emergency department technicians, the security guards who had walked me to the bus stop on dark mornings, and the entire overnight custodial crew. The harsh break room tables had been pushed together and covered in a bright plastic tablecloth. In the center sat a large, inexpensive grocery store sheet cake. The white frosting was slightly smeared on one edge and the blue piped letters were uneven. It spelled out, "Congratulations, Dr. Ford." My breath caught in my throat. I looked around the room at the tired, smiling faces of the people who worked the brutal nocturnal hours. These were the people who had saved cafeteria food for me when I was starving. These were the people who had covered my section when I needed 15 minutes to study for an organic chemistry exam. These were the people who had seen me at my lowest, scrubbed floors alongside me and lifted me up when my biological parents had tried to bury me. Dr. Bennett stepped forward. She did not offer a long emotional speech. She simply handed me a small wrapped rectangular box. "You earned your seat at the table," she said, her voice steady and commanding. "Now go show them how a real surgeon operates." I opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside lay a high-quality professional-grade stethoscope. The metal chest piece was engraved with my name. I looked at Dr. Bennett, then at the custodial supervisor who was cutting the sheet cake with a plastic knife. I ate that sugary artificial cake surrounded by the sounds of their laughter and shared stories. It tasted better than any gourmet meal I could ever imagine. That night, in the break room, I learned a vital truth about the human experience. Blood is merely a biological coincidence. It dictates the color of your eyes and the shape of your jaw, but it does not dictate loyalty. Shared DNA does not equal a shared heart. True family consists of the people who show up for you when the chips are down. Family is the group of individuals who celebrate your victories without jealousy, who shield you from the wind, and who actively invest in your potential. The people in that break room were my family. When my shift finally ended at 7 in the morning, I walked down to the staff locker room for the last time. The metal lockers were battered and covered in scratches. I spun the combination lock, opened the narrow metal door, and stared at the inside panel. Taped to the gray steel was the faded paper napkin from the diner. The word "Doctor" was written across it in black ink. The edges of the paper were brittle yellowing from age and exposure to the damp locker room air. I gently peeled the tape away, terrified of tearing the fragile material. I held the napkin in my palm. It was the artifact of my survival. It was the physical manifestation of the night my father laughed at my ambitions. I reached into my backpack and pulled out a specialized rigid plastic archival sleeve I had purchased from a craft store. I slid the diner napkin inside, sealing it tight to protect it from moisture and decay. I placed the plastic sleeve into the front pocket of my jacket right next to my heart. I packed up my sparse belongings from my studio apartment later that afternoon. I loaded my duffel bag and a few boxes into a used sedan I had purchased with my savings. I drove away from the city, leaving the toxic gravity of my childhood behind. I headed toward a new city, a new elite institution, and a brutal new phase of my existence. I disappeared into the grueling machinery of medical school. The next several years became a relentless blur of textbooks, clinical rotations, and sheer exhaustion. The curriculum was designed to break the weak, but I had already been broken and rebuilt by experts. When my wealthy classmates complained about the 100-hour work weeks during our surgical residencies, I remained silent. They did not understand that exhaustion is a privilege when it is fueled by purpose. I channeled every ounce of the trauma my parents inflicted upon me into my focus in the operating room. I utilized the memory of their contempt to hone my surgical precision. I faded into the work, transforming myself into a cardiothoracic surgeon capable of handling the most high-risk, complex procedures. I built a formidable reputation. I accumulated wealth, status, and power. I assumed I had successfully outrun Thomas Brenda and Jason Ford. I believed the past was securely locked away, just like the diner napkin hidden in my personal safe. But the universe possesses a wicked, undeniable sense of irony. The past rarely stays buried forever. The systemic traps my parents laid for me were destroyed, but their own poor choices were creating a new disaster. While I was building an empire, they were burning theirs to the ground. And the smoke from their ruin was about to drift directly into my pristine, carefully controlled world. The next 10 years of my life became an unrelenting blur of surgical residencies and grueling fellowship programs. I vanished into the sterile, high-stakes environment of the hospital. While my peers in their 20s spent their weekends traveling or attending weddings, I spent mine standing under glaring operating room lights. I chose cardiothoracic surgery. I specialized in high-risk valve replacements. Fixing broken hearts felt like a fitting career path for someone who had been forced to tape her own back together. I poured every ounce of the trauma my parents inflicted upon me into my surgical precision. Anger is a remarkably clean fuel source, if you know how to refine it. I channeled the memory of my father laughing at my ambitions into a laser-focused discipline. When a complex procedure stretched into its 14th hour and the attending physicians began to fade, I volunteered to take the lead. I thrived in the exhaustion. I had learned how to function on 3 hours of sleep in a hospital supply closet. Operating on patients felt like a luxury compared to scrubbing the floors beneath them. I built an ironclad reputation for handling the cases other surgeons deemed too difficult. By the time I turned 32, the hospital board named me Chief of Surgery. I was the youngest person in the institution's history to hold the title. 2 years later, the executive committee appointed me director of the hospital's charitable foundation. My responsibilities expanded far beyond the operating theater. I was now managing a multi-million-dollar endowment designed to provide life-saving grants for uninsured patients. I sat in a sleek corner office reviewing financial profiles, deciding who would receive the medical bailouts they desperately needed. I held the exact kind of financial power that had once been weaponized against me by my own family. During this decade of ascent, I remained a ghost to my biological parents. I never sent a holiday card. I never updated my contact information. I existed in a totally different stratosphere. But through the inevitable chatter of extended relatives, specifically, a chatty second cousin named Diane, who loved to gossip via social media messages, I kept tabs on the Ford family back in that working-class suburb. Their reality had fractured. The future my parents had bet their entire livelihood on had turned into a nightmare. Jason's landscaping empire had crumbled into dust. It turned out that unearned confidence and a shiny new truck do not equate to business acumen. He failed to pay his commercial taxes for 5 consecutive years. He took on commercial jobs he lacked the skill to finish, resulting in a cascade of breach of contract lawsuits. The revenue agency eventually audited him, seizing his assets and freezing his accounts. That heavy-duty truck my parents took out a second mortgage to buy was repossessed in the middle of the night. Bankrupt and facing potential jail time for tax evasion, the golden child moved back into his childhood bedroom. He was 36 years old, sleeping down the hall from our parents, contributing nothing to the household. Thomas and Brenda Ford did exactly what they had always done. They sacrificed everything to shield their favored son from his own consequences. They drained their retirement accounts to pay his legal retainers. When the funds ran dry, they took out a third mortgage on the family home. They were drowning in debt, working well past retirement age, tethered to an assembly line and an administrative desk, just to keep Jason out of federal prison. The house they loved was practically owned by the bank. Yet despite their catastrophic reality, their pride remained intact. They needed a scapegoat to deflect from Jason's undeniable failures. Cousin Diane inadvertently revealed the narrative my parents were spinning at church gatherings and neighborhood barbecues. They told everyone I was a college dropout. They claimed the pressure of the real world had broken my spirit. According to Thomas and Brenda, I had vanished because I was deeply ashamed of my failures and could not face the successful members of the family. When Diane relayed this rumor under the guise of fake concern, I simply smiled at my phone screen. I did not correct the delusion. I did not send a photograph of my medical degree or a screenshot of my investment accounts. I let them live in their fabricated reality. I preferred their ignorance. It kept them far away from me. While they sat in a decaying house, suffocating under the weight of their bad investments, I lived in a sprawling penthouse overlooking the Detroit skyline. I drove a tailored European sedan. I wore custom suits beneath my white lab coat. I had built an impenetrable fortress of success, and they were not invited inside. I thought I had permanently insulated myself from their chaos, but the universe possesses a wicked sense of irony. You can build the tallest walls in the world, and fate will still find a way to slide a piece of your past right under the door. It happened on a brisk Tuesday morning in October, the kind of crisp, clear autumn day that makes you feel invincible. I was sitting at my mahogany desk in the foundation office, sipping a dark roast coffee and reviewing a stack of quarterly budget reports. The hospital was humming with its usual controlled energy. The ambient noise of helicopters arriving on the roof and paging systems echoing through the halls felt like a second heartbeat to me. My lead caseworker knocked twice and pushed open the heavy glass door of my office without waiting for a response. She looked unusually tense. She was clutching a thick manila intake folder tightly against her chest. She walked briskly across the room and stood in front of my desk. She explained that a high-profile emergency charity case had just arrived through the emergency department. The patient was in critical condition. His heart was failing. He required an immediate, highly complex surgical intervention to survive the week. The problem was the finances. The patient possessed zero health insurance, zero liquid assets, and a credit profile ruined by multiple foreclosures. He was a financial liability to the hospital. The caseworker sighed, rubbing her temples. She explained that the family of the patient was downstairs in the main lobby, causing a major disturbance. They were yelling at the administrative staff, refusing to leave, and demanding an immediate face-to-face meeting with the foundation director to secure a $200,000 charitable grant. I set down my coffee mug. The hospital dealt with desperate families every single day. Panic makes people act erratically when their loved ones are facing death. But we had a protocol. Families filled out the paperwork, and the committee reviewed the assets. We did not grant impromptu audiences simply because someone shouted at a receptionist. I told the caseworker to inform security and have the family escorted to the standard financial planning department. The caseworker shook her head. She placed the thick manila folder directly in the center of my desk. She told me I needed to look at the intake forms before calling security. She said the son of the patient was threatening to call local news outlets, claiming the hospital was leaving a hard-working blue-collar man to die over money. I reached out and opened the cover of the file. My eyes scanned the typed text moving past the medical jargon and the grim diagnostic codes straight to the demographic information. My breath caught in my throat. The words printed in bold black ink leaped off the page, striking me with the force of a physical blow. The universe had just delivered the ultimate test package neatly in a standard hospital intake file, resting right on my desk. It happened on a brisk Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of crisp, clear autumn day that makes you feel untouchable. I was sitting at my mahogany desk in the foundation office, sipping a dark roast coffee and reviewing a stack of quarterly budget reports. The hospital was humming with its usual controlled energy. The ambient noise of helicopters arriving on the roof and paging systems echoing through the halls felt like a steady, reliable heartbeat. My life was ordered, predictable, and safe. My lead caseworker, Sarah, knocked twice and pushed open the heavy glass door of my office without waiting for a response. Sarah was a seasoned professional who rarely lost her composure. She had handled grieving widows and frantic families for decades, navigating the worst days of their lives with steadfast grace. But today, her jaw was tight, and she clutched a thick manila intake folder tightly against her chest. She walked briskly across the room and dropped the file onto the center of my desk with a heavy thud. "We have a critical patient down in the emergency department," she said, rubbing her temples. "The medical situation is dire, but the family dynamic is a logistical nightmare. The patient presented with severe aortic stenosis. His heart valves are failing rapidly, restricting blood flow to the rest of his body. He requires a highly complex bypass surgery immediately to survive the week. The surgical team is on standby and the operating room is prepped, but there is a profound problem with the finances." Sarah explained that the patient possessed zero health insurance. His basic state coverage was woefully insufficient for the specialized cardiovascular procedure required. He had zero liquid assets and a credit profile ruined by multiple recent foreclosures. He was a severe financial liability to the hospital. Normally, our department would evaluate the case through a standard review process, allocating funds based on available charitable reserves and long-term recovery prospects. But this family was not waiting for a standard review. "The son of the patient is downstairs in the main lobby causing a major disturbance," Sarah continued, her voice strained with frustration. "He is berating the administrative staff, refusing to step away from the reception desk, and demanding an immediate face-to-face meeting with the foundation director. He insists we bypass all protocols and secure a $200,000 charitable grant today." I set down my coffee mug. The hospital dealt with desperate relatives every single day. Fear makes people act erratically when their loved ones are facing imminent death. We were accustomed to de-escalating panic. I reached out and opened the cover of the file. My eyes scanned the typed text, moving past the complex medical jargon and the grim diagnostic codes straight to the demographic information. My breath caught in my throat. The air in my spacious corner office suddenly felt thin. The words printed in bold black ink leapt off the page, striking me with the force of a physical blow. "Patient name Thomas Ford, next of kin Brenda Ford and Jason Ford. 16 years. It had been 16 years since I walked out of that working-class house into a blinding Detroit snowstorm. 16 years since my father laughed at my ambitions and my mother stole my life savings to bail out her favored son. I stared at the names on the intake sheet. The universe had just delivered the ultimate test packaged neatly in a standard hospital file resting right on my desk. The people who told me I was a bad investment were now sitting in the lobby of my hospital begging my foundation for a financial rescue. I looked closer at the financial intake forms Sarah had gathered. The harsh reality of their current situation was laid bare in cold, hard numbers. They had nothing left. The sprawling suburban house with the manicured lawn was gone. The retirement accounts were drained to zero. They were listing a cheap monthly rental apartment as their primary address. Jason had squandered every dime they possessed trying to salvage his doomed landscaping business, and now they were entirely destitute. They had traded their financial security to protect a son who could not even afford a basic health insurance premium for his dying father. Sarah rolled her eyes, unaware of the internal earthquake tearing through my chest. "The son. Jason is incredibly hostile," she sighed, crossing her arms. He is down there yelling at the triage nurses demanding VIP treatment. He keeps shouting that they deserve the grant because they are hardworking, honest people who just fell on tough times. He claims corporate charity types like us owe working-class families a break. He even threatened to call local news outlets and tell them the hospital is leaving a blue-collar man to die over money. Hardworking, honest people. The phrase echoed in my mind, dripping with bitter irony. These were the same people who had actively tried to destroy my future. They had held my financial aid hostage to extort me. They had forced me to scrub operating room floors on 3 hours of sleep while they boasted about their golden child to the neighbors. Now that same golden child was 36 years old, bankrupt, and throwing a tantrum in a hospital lobby, expecting a faceless institution to foot the bill for his family crisis. He thought he was intimidating a bureaucratic administrator. He had no idea the woman holding his father's life in her hands was the sister he had treated like a live-in servant. The temptation to deny the grant was overwhelming. With one swift stroke of my pen, I could reject the application. I could cite their lack of financial planning, their hostile behavior toward hospital staff, and our limited charitable resources. I could send them away to figure out their own problems, just as my father had told me to figure out my own financial aid all those years ago. It would be effortless. It would be pure, poetic justice. They would walk out of those sliding glass doors with nothing exactly the way they had forced me to leave. I could let them feel the exact same terror I felt sitting in the freezing back seat of a rusted sedan with only $14 to my name. I looked away from the financial ruin and focused on the medical charts attached to the back of the file. Severe aortic stenosis. Left untreated, my father would not survive the month. His heart was giving out. I closed my eyes and took a slow, deep breath, letting the silence of my office ground me. I thought about Dr. Sylvia Bennett. I thought about the night she found me crying in the supply closet. She had taught me that a surgeon's duty supersedes personal grievances. I took an oath to save lives. I swore to protect the sick and heal the broken, even if the broken person lying on the gurney was the man who had tried to break me. I could not let him die. I would not allow their toxicity to compromise my professional integrity. I was a healer. I had spent a decade building a life based on saving people, not punishing them. However, saving his life did not mean shielding them from the truth. They wanted a meeting with the foundation director. They wanted to march into an executive suite and manipulate a corporate entity into handing them $200,000. They wanted to use their aggressive tactics to bully their way into a free surgery. I decided to give them exactly what they asked for. They were going to get their meeting. I closed the manila folder and looked up at Sarah. Her expression shifted from frustration to concern as she noticed the sudden rigid tension in my posture. "Tell hospital security to stand down," I said quietly, keeping my voice smooth and clinical. "Do not call the police. I will handle the son." Sarah looked surprised but nodded her head. She knew better than to question my directives. "What should I tell the family?" she asked, gathering her notes. I picked up my favorite silver pen and tapped it against the heavy cardstock of the intake file. I felt a profound sense of calm wash over me. The years of hiding and silent grinding were over. "Tell them the director has agreed to hear their case," I replied. "Schedule the meeting for 2 o'clock this afternoon. Put them in the executive boardroom. Let them wait." I sat back in my leather chair and turned to the secondary monitor on my desk. With a few quick keystrokes, I pulled up the live security feed from the main hospital lobby. There they were, the Ford family captured in high-definition overhead surveillance, creating a spectacle in front of the admissions desk. The last time I saw my father, he was a towering, furious figure blocking the doorway of our living room, his heavy work boots tracking snow and authority onto the floor. The man on the screen was a ghost of that memory. Thomas Ford sat slumped in a standard-issue hospital wheelchair. His shoulders rounded his skin a terrifying shade of gray. His formidable presence had evaporated, leaving behind a frail, terrified patient whose heart was quite literally failing him. My mother Brenda paced the linoleum floor behind his wheelchair. The stylish administrative outfits she used to wear were gone. She was dressed in a faded, ill-fitting sweater and worn-out slacks that looked a decade out of date. The financial ruin Jason had brought upon them was written in the very fabric of her clothes. She twisted a crumpled tissue between her hands, her face etched with a desperate, frantic energy. But it was Jason who drew my focus. At 36 years old, my older brother had not aged into responsibility. He was leaning heavily over the curved reception desk, trapping a young, terrified administrative assistant behind her keyboard. He was aggressively jabbing his finger in her direction. I leaned forward and turned up the audio feed on my computer. The crisp microphone picked up his voice instantly, carrying the exact same arrogant, entitled tone he used when he was 18 and demanding I wash his grease-stained clothes. "Listen to me." Jason barked, his voice echoing through the quiet waiting area. "My dad is a hard-working taxpayer. We are not some charity case you can just brush off. We demand to see the head of the foundation right now. We are not leaving this building until they write the check and get him into surgery." The sheer audacity was breathtaking. He was standing in a hospital lobby, entirely bankrupt, living in his parents' rental apartment because he had destroyed their financial security, yet he was still dripping with the unearned entitlement they had bred into him. He truly believed the world owed him a favor simply because he existed. He believed he could intimidate a corporate entity into handing him $200,000, just like he had intimidated my parents into handing over my college savings. The young receptionist tried to speak, holding up her hands in a placating gesture, but Jason cut her off again. "Do not quote policy to me," he sneered, puffing out his chest. "I run a business. I know how these corporate charity types operate. You people have millions sitting in an endowment fund. You are going to allocate those funds to my father today, or I am calling the local news stations and telling them this hospital lets blue-collar men die in the lobby." My mother stopped her frantic pacing and chimed in, her voice shrill and pleading. She stepped up beside Jason, reinforcing his hostility with a weaponized vulnerability. "Please, Miss Brenda," wailed, placing her hands flat on the desk. "We have sacrificed everything for our family. We gave up our home. We spent our entire retirement trying to keep our son afloat. We just need a little grace from the people who hold the purse strings." I stared at the monitor, my jaw clenching so tight my teeth ached. "We have sacrificed everything for our family." She dared to use that phrase. She dared to weaponize the very concept of family sacrifice to demand a bailout. It was the exact same justification she had used 16 years ago when I asked why she emptied my savings account. Family comes first, she had told me right before watching me walk out into a blizzard. They had not changed. Not a single microscopic bit. The severe adversity they had faced over the past decade had not humbled them. Losing their sprawling suburban house, draining their retirement, and watching Jason's landscaping empire collapse into federal tax debt had not taught them accountability. The consequences of their own toxic choices had only made them louder, more desperate, and more convinced of their own victimhood. They still believed that their suffering was someone else's responsibility to fix. They still believed they were owed salvation without having to earn it. I muted the audio feed. I had heard enough. I did not need to listen to Jason berate my staff any longer. The trap was set and they were marching willingly toward the jaws. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the discreet wall panel near my bookshelf. I slid the wood veneer aside, revealing the keypad to my personal hidden safe. I punched in the combination and pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside the safe, resting beneath a stack of current foundation financial portfolios, was a faded, thick manila folder. I had not opened this specific file in years. I had preserved it meticulously, carrying it with me through every apartment, every dorm room, and every office I had occupied since the age of 18. The tab on the edge of the folder was unmarked, but I knew exactly what it contained. The receipts. The undeniable paper trailed truth of my existence. I pulled the folder from the safe and laid it flat on my desk. I opened the cover. The documents inside were pristine, kept safe from moisture and light. I selected 3 specific pieces of paper. The first was the bank statement from the local credit union clearly showing the unauthorized withdrawal of $5,400 signed by Brenda Ford. The second was the official federal dependency override approval letter from the university detailing the severe parental alienation. The third was the collection of sworn affidavits and police reports proving my homelessness. I slipped these documents into a sleek leather portfolio. Then I turned back to the safe. Resting in the very back, propped up against the steel wall, was a small, high-quality picture frame. Inside the glass was not a photograph of a loved one or a degree from a prestigious university. It was a cheap yellowed paper napkin from a roadside diner. The word "doctor" was written across the center in faded black ink. I picked up the frame, feeling the cool glass beneath my fingertips. This was my artifact. This was the physical manifestation of the night they laughed at my dreams. I carefully placed the framed napkin into my leather briefcase right next to the documentation of their abuse. I gathered my white coat, ensuring my name and title were clearly visible. The time for hiding in supply closets was over. The time for remaining a ghost in their narrative had officially expired. I was about to walk into an executive boardroom and face the people who tried to destroy me. They thought they were going to manipulate a faceless corporate bureaucrat. They thought they were going to bully a stranger into saving their lives. I was going to show them exactly who held the power now, and the reckoning was going to be televised. At exactly 5 minutes before 2 in the afternoon, my administrative assistant escorted the Ford family onto the executive floor. I stood in the darkened observation corridor adjacent to the main boardroom. The wall dividing us was constructed of specialized two-way glass. I could see and hear every single breath they took while they saw nothing but a sleek mirror reflecting their own desperate situation. The executive boardroom was designed to project authority. It sat on the top floor of the hospital tower, featuring pristine floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping view of the Michigan industrial skyline. The room was dominated by a sprawling custom-built mahogany table surrounded by 12 high-backed leather chairs. It was a space intended for negotiating multi-million-dollar medical contracts and securing wealthy donor endowments. It was not a room meant for a bankrupt landscaping contractor and his destitute parents. I watched as my administrative assistant guided my father's wheelchair through the heavy wooden doors. Thomas Ford looked remarkably small in that sprawling corporate space. The sharp industrial light pouring through the windows highlighted the gray pallor of his skin and the shallow, labored rhythm of his breathing. His failing heart was struggling to supply his body with basic oxygen. The man who had once terrified me with his booming voice and heavy steel-toed boots was now hunched over his trembling hands, resting weakly on the armrests of the hospital-issued wheelchair. My mother followed close behind him. Brenda looked intensely uncomfortable. She clutched a worn handbag against her chest, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She reached out to trace the stitching on one of the expensive leather chairs, her expression a strange mixture of awe and defensive judgment. She had spent her entire life mocking corporate professionals as soft and lazy, yet here she was standing in the cathedral of their success, hoping to receive their charity. Then came Jason. At 36 years old, my brother possessed nothing to his name except tax liens and a string of failed business ventures. Yet he swaggered into the boardroom with the unearned confidence of a conquering hero. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit jacket over a wrinkled shirt. He did not guide our father to a comfortable spot or offer to pull out a chair for our mother. Instead, Jason walked straight to the head of the mahogany table. He pulled out the oversized executive chair reserved for the foundation director and dropped himself into it, kicking his feet out and leaning back as if he owned the entire building. My assistant informed them that the director would be joining them shortly and quietly exited the room. The moment the heavy doors clicked shut, the performance dropped, and the true dynamic of the Ford family emerged. The hidden microphones in the ceiling picked up their audio, perfectly piping their conversation directly into my observation corridor. I crossed my arms and listened. "Do not worry about a thing," Jason boasted to my mother, waving his hand dismissively around the elegant room. Let me handle the director when they walk in. These corporate charity types are pushovers. They have millions sitting around in tax write-off accounts, and they feel guilty hoarding it. I know how to talk to these people. Brenda wrung her hands together, her gaze fixed anxiously on the closed doors. Please, Jason, she fretted. Just be polite. We have sacrificed everything for our family. We just need a little grace from them so your father can get his surgery. Jason scoffed, adjusting his collar with a pathetic attempt at superiority. I will get Dad's surgery covered, he declared loudly. And honestly, while we have them on the hook, I will see if I can get them to cover our travel and lodging expenses too. It is a long drive from our apartment, and we should not have to pay for gas and food while we deal with this medical crisis. They owe working-class families a break. I stood in the shadows of the hallway, listening to his hubris echo through the overhead speakers. The sheer delusion was staggering. My brother had bankrupted my parents, drained their retirement, and lost their family home. Yet, he was sitting in a hospital boardroom demanding not only a life-saving grant for his dying father, but also free gas money and luxury hotel accommodations. He believed he was a brilliant negotiator about to manipulate a faceless corporate bureaucrat. They had not changed. They had not learned humility or accountability. They still believed the world existed to serve them. I turned away from the glass and walked over to a small side table in the corridor. I opened my sleek leather briefcase and pulled out the thick manila folder I had retrieved from my personal safe. It was time to arrange my artifacts. It was time to prepare the evidence that would finally dismantle their alternate reality. I laid the documents out one by one. First, I placed the printed credit union bank statement from 16 years ago. The black ink clearly displayed the unauthorized withdrawal of $5,400 signed by Brenda Ford, the exact price of my stolen college tuition. Next, I placed the official police reports and the sworn affidavits I had collected to secure my federal dependency override. These legal documents detailed the extreme parental alienation and abuse I had suffered, proving to the federal government that I was a homeless independent student. Then I pulled out a slightly wrinkled printout of a text message thread. I had saved this specific conversation from my third year of medical school. During that time, Jason's heavy-duty truck had finally been repossessed by the bank after he defaulted on his loans. My mother had somehow acquired my new cell phone number. She did not call to ask about my rigorous surgical rotations or my well-being. She texted me to demand that I sign over the title to my cheap used sedan. She wrote that since I lived near a hospital campus, I did not need a vehicle, whereas my brother had real clients waiting and needed my car to save his business. When I refused her absurd demand, she sent a barrage of messages, calling me a selfish, ungrateful traitor to the family. I aligned that printout right next to the bank statement. The paper trail of their relentless generational parasitism was undeniable. Finally, I reached into the interior pocket of my briefcase. I pulled out a specialized rigid plastic sleeve. Inside rested the yellowed, brittle paper napkin from the roadside diner. The word doctor was written across it in faded black ink, the ultimate reminder of the night they laughed at my dreams. Let me pause here. If your family ever treated you like an ATM while calling you worthless, drop a yes in the comments. Because what happens next is for all of us who ever had to build an empire in the dark just to prove we deserve to exist. I gathered the crisp, undeniable documents and stacked them neatly inside the manila folder. I placed the framed diner napkin on top. I picked up the stack feeling the profound, heavy weight of 16 years of silent grinding and survival. I looked down at my tailored white coat. I checked the navy blue embroidery resting over my heart. Matilda Ford, MD-FACS, Chief of Surgery. I took a deep, steadying breath. The air filled my lungs cool and clean. I was no longer the terrified 18-year-old girl shivering in the back seat of a rusted sedan. I was the architect of my own destiny. I walked to the end of the corridor, turned the corner, and approached the heavy double doors of the executive boardroom. I gripped the polished brass handles, pushed the doors open, and walked in. I wore my tailored white coat. The fabric was crisp and stark against the dim, polished wood of the boardroom. Embroidered in precise navy blue thread over my heart were the words, Matilda Ford, M.D. F.A.C.S., Chief of Surgery. I walked through the heavy double doors with measured, deliberate steps. I did not rush. I did not hesitate. I moved with the authority of someone who had earned every square inch of the ground she stood on. I approached the head of the mahogany table, stopping directly across from where my brother was sprawled in the executive chair. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the kind of profound, breathless quiet that occurs right before a shockwave hits. My mother's mouth fell open. Her jaw practically unhinged in a silent, paralyzed scream. She stared at the embroidery on my chest as if the letters were written in a foreign language she could not comprehend. My father, slouched in his hospital wheelchair, clutched his chest. His gray face turned an even more alarming shade of ash. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, trying to reconcile the powerful woman standing before him with the helpless teenager he had thrown out into the snow. Jason stared at me. His arrogant, entitled smirk melted into an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. The swagger evaporated from his posture. He gripped the armrests of the executive chair, his knuckles turning white, looking like a man who had just realized he was sitting on a live landmine. "Matilda," my mother finally gasped. Her voice was thin, shaky, and stripped of its usual condescension. "You are working here. You are a nurse." "No, Brenda," I said. I kept my voice smooth, clinical, and completely devoid of warmth. I set my leather briefcase down on the polished table with a soft, authoritative thud. "I am the chief of cardiothoracic surgery. I am also the director of the foundation you are currently begging for a $200,000 charitable grant." The air left the room. Jason's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The veins in his neck bulged as he struggled to process the reality of the situation. "This is a joke," he stammered, his voice cracking. You run this foundation. You are the person in charge of the money." My father, desperate and grasping for a lifeline, immediately shifted his tactics. He had spent his entire life bullying people into submission, but he realized instantly that intimidation would not work here. He tried to pivot to affection. "Matilda," he rasped, leaning forward in his wheelchair, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "My God, look at you. We always knew you would make it. We always knew you had it in you. We are so incredibly proud of you. Thank God our daughter is here to save us." The sheer audacity of his statement was breathtaking. It was a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. He was attempting to rewrite history in real time, trying to claim credit for a success he had actively tried to destroy. He thought he could simply play the role of the proud patriarch and erase 16 years of estrangement and abuse. He thought blood alone would secure his salvation. "Your daughter?" I asked. My voice was deadly calm. It was the exact tone I used in the operating room when a complication arose and absolute focus was required. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out the first artifact of their betrayal. I slid the printed credit union bank statement across the vast expanse of the mahogany table. The paper glided smoothly, stopping right in front of my mother's trembling hands. "Is this how you treat your daughter?" I asked, staring directly into Brenda's eyes. I watched her look down at the document. I watched her recognize the date, the amount, and her own forged signature. "That is the bank statement from 16 years ago," I continued, ensuring my voice carried clearly to the hidden microphones recording the session. "That is the exact record of the day you emptied my college savings account. $5,400. Money I earned wiping down diner tables so you could pay for Jason's drunk driving legal fees." My mother shrank back in her chair, pulling her hands away from the paper as if it were radioactive. She looked frantically at my father, searching for someone to rescue her from accountability. But Thomas was staring at the bank statement, his chest heaving, unable to formulate a defense. Jason opened his mouth, his old instinct to attack overriding his current desperation. "That was a long time ago," he sneered, though his voice lacked its usual volume. "You are rich now. You clearly did not need that money. You made it anyway. You owe us for pushing you." I turned my gaze to him. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "I do not owe you anything, Jason," I said, leaning forward slightly, resting my hands on the table. "You drained their retirement accounts. You bankrupted this family with your failed landscaping business and your tax evasion. I spent 16 years building an empire, while you spent 16 years tearing theirs down. You are 36 years old living in your childhood bedroom and you have the nerve to sit in my boardroom and demand I pay for the consequences of your incompetence. Jason's jaw clamped shut. He looked away, unable to maintain eye contact with the sister he had treated like a servant. The reality of his own pathetic situation, contrasted with the undeniable proof of my success, shattered his fragile ego. My father began to weep. It was a pathetic, gasping sound. He clutched the armrests of his wheelchair, tears streaming down his gray cheeks. "Matilda, please," he begged, his voice breaking. "I am sorry. I was wrong about everything. I should not have laughed at you. I should not have kicked you out, but my heart is failing. I will die without this bypass surgery. You took an oath to save lives. You have to help me." I looked at the man who had laughed at my dreams. I looked at the man who had ordered me to surrender my future to package auto parts on an assembly line. He was now a terrified patient, completely at my mercy, pleading for his life. He was right about one thing. I took an oath. But fulfilling my professional duty did not mean I had to surrender my personal boundaries. I was about to show them exactly where my obligations ended and their consequences began. The surgery would happen, but the terms of their survival were about to change drastically. 16 years ago, you stole my college fund to pay for Jason's drunk driving attorney, I said. My voice echoed in the quiet, cavernous space of the boardroom. The acoustics in the executive suite were designed for clarity, ensuring that every single syllable I spoke landed with clinical precision. I watched the realization wash over my mother. Brenda shrank back in her oversized leather chair, her shoulders curling inward. She pulled her hands off the polished mahogany table and tucked them into her lap, as if trying to hide the very fingers that had forged the withdrawal slip. The pristine environment of the hospital tower offered her nowhere to hide. She had spent a decade and a half spinning a narrative to her church group and her neighbors, claiming I was a troubled dropout who ran away from honest work. Now the physical proof of her theft sat illuminated under the modern recessed lighting, shattering her carefully constructed reality. She could not formulate a single excuse. Jason leaned forward, his face twisting into a defensive sneer. His lifelong instinct to attack whenever he felt cornered kicked in immediately. He opened his mouth to argue, preparing to deploy the same loud, hostile tactics he had just used to intimidate the administrative assistants down in the lobby. "That is ancient history," he started to say, his voice booming in an attempt to reclaim control of the room. "We are talking about life and death right now, not some childhood allowance." I cut him off before he could finish the thought. I did not raise my voice. I simply dropped the temperature in the room, projecting the same unyielding authority I utilized when directing a surgical team through a cardiac crisis. "We are not discussing ancient history," I stated, locking my eyes onto his. "We are establishing a pattern of behavior." I reached into my leather portfolio and retrieved the second artifact. I placed a thick stack of government paperwork onto the table. The official seal of the United States Department of Education sat clearly on the top page. I slid the dependency override documents across the smooth wood, stopping them right in front of my father's wheelchair. And when I needed a simple signature on a standard tax return to maintain my financial aid, you refused. I continued, directing my words to Thomas. "You tried to extort me. You told me you would only provide the required federal documentation if I leveraged my pristine student credit to co-sign a commercial equipment loan for Jason's failing landscaping business." My father looked down at the dense legal forms. His breathing grew shallow and erratic. His hands trembled against the armrests of his wheelchair. He remembered that phone call. He remembered mocking my ambitions and hanging up on me. I had to sit in a room with clinical social workers and prove to the federal government that you legally and financially abandoned me, I said, letting the gravity of the legal process settle over them. I had to gather police dispatch logs and sworn affidavits from my diner coworkers. I had to build a watertight case documenting your abuse just so I could retain the right to clean blood off the hospital operating room floors on 3 hours of sleep. I scrubbed biohazards every single night to pay for the organic chemistry textbooks you threw on the kitchen floor. The truth stripped away their carefully constructed facade. It exposed the rotting foundation they had built their lives upon. They could no longer hide behind the excuse of being hardworking, honest people who just fell on tough times. They were the architects of their own ruin, and they had tried to bury me in the foundation. Jason could not tolerate the exposure. The fragile ego he had nurtured for 36 years fractured under the weight of his own documented failures. He slammed his palms flat against the heavy mahogany table. The sharp, cracking sound startled my mother, causing her to jump in her seat. "You are rich now!" Jason shouted, his voice cracking with desperate entitlement. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson. He gestured wildly around the luxurious executive suite. "Look at this room. Look at your fancy suit. You owe us. Dad is dying right in front of you, and you are sitting here holding a grudge over a few $1,000s from high school. You took an oath to save lives. You have to write the check." I turned my gaze to him. I let the silence stretch for a long, deliberate moment. I watched him squirm under the clinical, analytical stare I reserved for diagnosing complex arterial blockages. He was not a threat to me. He was a bankrupt man throwing a tantrum in a room he did not belong in. "I do not owe you a single dime, Jason," I said smoothly. The chill in my voice anchored the room, freezing his outburst in its tracks. "You are the reason they are sitting here begging for charity. You drained their retirement accounts to zero. You manipulated them into taking out second and third mortgages on their home to fund a business you were too lazy to actually run. You bankrupted this family." I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table, closing the distance between us. I spent 16 years building an empire from nothing. I spent 16 years operating on dying patients, running this charitable foundation, and earning every piece of authority I hold in this building. While I was building an empire, you spent 16 years tearing theirs down to the studs. Do not ever speak to me about what I owe this family. The air rushed out of Jason's lungs. He opened his mouth, searching for a comeback, searching for a way to assert his dominance. But he found nothing. He slumped back into the executive chair, his bravado dissolving into a defeated silence. He finally understood that his status as the favored son held zero currency in my boardroom. He was nothing here. My father, witnessing the total dismantling of his golden child, reached his breaking point. The realization that he had sacrificed his entire life, his home, and his financial security for a son who was a parasite finally broke through his stubborn pride. He looked at Jason shrinking in the chair, and then looked back at me standing tall in my white coat. Thomas Ford began to weep. It was a harsh, agonizing sound, the sound of a man confronting the catastrophic consequences of his own hubris at the very end of his life. Tears spilled over his sunken gray cheeks, catching in the deep wrinkles around his mouth. His frail shoulders shook with the force of his sobs. The monitor attached to his wheelchair beeped steadily, tracking his erratic heart rate. "Matilda, please," he begged, his voice a hoarse, ragged whisper. He lifted one trembling hand from his wheelchair, reaching out toward me across the wide expanse of the table. "I am sorry. I am so sorry. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything. I will die without this surgery." I stood at the head of the boardroom table, looking down at the man who had laughed at my dreams. I remembered the booming sound of his laughter echoing down the high school hallway. I remembered the stinging cold of the November snowstorm biting through my thin denim jacket as I walked away from his house. He was no longer the terrifying foreman who ruled our working-class household with an iron fist and rigid ultimatums. He was just a terrified dying patient utterly at my mercy. I looked down at Thomas Ford. He was weeping openly now, the tears catching in the deep creases of his weathered face and falling onto the lapels of his faded jacket. The man who had ruled our household with iron-fisted demands was reduced to a fragile patient begging for mercy. He waited for my answer, his shallow breaths echoing in the quiet boardroom. My mother held her breath, her hands clasped tight in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. Even Jason sat perfectly still, the arrogant swagger fully drained from his posture. They expected me to exact a cruel vengeance. They anticipated that I would use my authority to deny the funding, cast them out into the street, and let my father succumb to his failing heart. They projected their own vindictive nature onto me, but I had not spent the last 16 years training to become a killer. I spent that time learning how to heal. I took an oath to preserve human life, regardless of the person inhabiting the body on the operating table. My professional integrity was not something I would ever compromise, especially not for people who lacked any integrity of their own. I straightened my posture and smoothed the lapels of my white coat. I am going to approve the $200,000 foundation grant for your surgery, Dad, I said. My voice was smooth, level, and devoid of emotional attachment. I will authorize the financial transfer to the cardiac department this afternoon. Your procedure will be scheduled immediately. The room exhaled. A palpable wave of relief crashed over the three of them. My father slumped back in his wheelchair, letting out a ragged, weeping sigh of gratitude. My mother covered her face with her hands, thanking heaven and praising my generosity as if I were a distant savior rather than the daughter she had discarded. Jason leaned back in the executive chair, a familiar, sickening smirk creeping back onto his face. In his mind, the crisis was averted. He believed the family dynamic had reasserted itself. The successful sister was stepping in to clean up his catastrophic mess, just as they had always demanded. He likely thought my lecture was merely a tax he had to pay before receiving the ultimate bailout. He assumed the open checkbook was next. I could see his gears turning, already calculating how to redirect the surplus funds to cover their hotel stays, their living expenses, and his own mounting legal debts. I let them enjoy their hollow victory for exactly 10 seconds. However, I continued. My tone dropped a full octave, freezing the smirk right off Jason's face. There are firm, non-negotiable conditions attached to this approval. I am authorizing the financial grant for the institution. I am not your surgeon. I will not perform the bypass. I will not consult on your recovery plan, and I will not be present in the waiting room. You will be assigned to the on-call cardiothoracic attending physician. My father looked up, his eyes wide with renewed panic, but I held up my hand to stop him from speaking. Furthermore, I stated, driving the final nail into their expectations. The foundation grant covers the precise cost of the medical procedure and the intensive care recovery unit. That is all. Not a single dime of my personal wealth will go toward Jason's outstanding business debts. I will not pay your secondary mortgages. I will not cover your travel expenses, your hotel accommodations, or your daily meals. My charity extends to preserving a human life. It does not extend to funding your lifestyle or shielding your favored son from his own bankruptcy. The relief evaporated from my mother's face, replaced instantly by frantic desperation. She lunged forward in her seat, reaching her hands across the wide expanse of the mahogany table, her fingers grasping at the empty air between us. "But we are family," she pleaded, her voice cracking with a high-pitched, frantic energy. "We have nothing left, Matilda. Jason lost the business. The bank is taking the house next week. How are we supposed to survive while your father recovers? You live in a penthouse. We know you have millions. You cannot just leave us with nothing." I took a deliberate step backward, staying entirely out of her physical reach. My expression remained locked in a clinical mask. "You made your choice 16 years ago," I said. My words were sharp and measured, cutting straight through her theatrical sobbing. "You chose to fund a criminal defense rather than my education. You chose to protect a toxic son while throwing your teenage daughter out into a blinding November snowstorm with $14 to her name. You left me with nothing. I simply learned how to build an empire out of the ice you left me in. I do not owe you a rescue boat now that your own ship is sinking." Jason stood up, his face red with renewed fury. "You are going to let your own parents go homeless," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me. "I am letting you take responsibility for your parents, Jason," I replied coldly. "You are their investment. Now it is time for you to yield a return." I turned my attention away from his sputtering anger and reached into my leather briefcase. I bypassed the stacks of financial records and police reports. My fingers found the smooth glass of the small picture frame I had packed that morning. I pulled it out and held it up to the light. Inside the frame rested the brittle yellowed paper napkin from the roadside diner. The faded black ink still spelled out the word, Doctor. I walked around the edge of the large table and stopped directly in front of my father's wheelchair. I placed the framed napkin down on the polished wood right in front of his trembling hands. He looked down at it. His eyes widened as the memory from that parent-teacher conference flooded his mind. He recognized the artifact of his own cruelty. "You told me to be realistic that night," I whispered, leaning down, so only he could hear the finality in my voice. "You laughed at my dreams and told me to face reality." I tapped the glass of the frame. "This is reality, Thomas. I built it while you were not looking." I did not wait for a response. I did not need to hear another hollow apology or witness another desperate plea for cash. I turned my back on Thomas Brenda and Jason Ford. I walked toward the heavy double doors of the executive boardroom, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor in a steady, unbroken rhythm. I pushed the doors open and walked out into the brightly lit corridor, leaving them sitting in the suffocating ruins of their own consequences. They were trapped in a pristine corporate suite, facing the exact reality they had created for themselves. I did not seek revenge. Revenge requires carrying venom in your heart, and I had no space left for their poison. I only sought the truth. And the truth is the most devastating weapon you can wield against people who have spent their entire lives hiding behind lies. I walked back to my corner office, the afternoon sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the Detroit skyline. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and opened the next patient file on my desk. The crushing weight I had carried since I was 18 years old was finally gone. I felt light. I felt powerful. I felt free. If you are watching this, and you have ever been the scapegoat in your own home, if you have ever been told your dreams are too big or your worth is too small by the people who were supposed to protect you, I want you to hear this clearly. Your value is never determined by the people who are blind to it. Your potential does not require their permission or their funding. Real strength is built in the dark. It is forged in the quiet, agonizing moments when you choose to keep going despite the freezing cold. You build your empire in the shadows, brick by brick, shift by shift, and eventually it will shine in the light. Do not let anyone guilt you into funding their dysfunction. Do not let anyone convince you that setting a boundary is an act of betrayal. It is an act of survival. Keep grinding, keep protecting your hard-earned peace, and never let anyone tear down what you are building. Thank you for listening to my story. Take care of yourselves out there.
I sit at my kitchen table long after the sun has gone down. The house is quiet. The only sound is the low, steady hum of the refrigerator. I have shared countless narratives with you on this channel. We have explored the lives of daughters cast out into brutal winter storms for daring to protect their hard-earned scholarships. We have witnessed the quiet agony of sons leveraged for their credit scores to fund their parents' delusions. We have examined the tragedy of golden children who crumble under the weight of unearned praise and the triumph of forgotten siblings who build unshakable empires from the dust of their rejection. When you strip away the specific names and the varied locations of these fractured lives, you find the exact same heartbreaking pattern lying underneath. We are witnessing a modern tragedy where the core values of the traditional American family are slowly eroded by a relentless pursuit of materialism, vanity, and deep-seated selfishness. From a spiritual and philosophical perspective, the family unit is not intended to be a stage where we perform an illusion of perfection for the neighborhood. It is a training ground. It is the sacred space where we learn to refine our own character. Raising a child in our society today frequently feels like a competitive sport. Parents boast about prestigious university admissions, impressive job titles, and grand, expensive weddings. They use their children as trophies to display on the mantle of public opinion. But true parenting requires us to step back from this toxic race and cultivate three fundamental pillars of character wisdom, morality, and inner strength. Let us begin with wisdom. True understanding does not mean knowing which elite school guarantees the highest financial return. Wisdom is the profound ability to look at your child and see their inherent human value, regardless of whether they meet your societal expectations or fulfill your unlived dreams. A child is not a shiny hood ornament designed to elevate your status at the local country club. When parents practice blatant favoritism, they operate out of profound ignorance. They water the roots of one plant while pouring toxic salt on the roots of another. They fail to understand the simple universal law of cause and effect. Every harsh word spoken in anger, every subtle dismissal at the dinner table, and every choice to ignore a child's accomplishments plants a tiny resilient seed. Seeds of coldness and injustice will always grow into towering walls of resentment and eventual estrangement. On the other hand, seeds of tolerance and warm encouragement blossom into genuine, lifelong gratitude. We must find the courage to let go of the desperate need for external validation. The pursuit of prestige is a heavy, suffocating chain. Too many parents sacrifice their own flesh and blood on the altar of public opinion, terrified of what the community might think if a daughter works as a janitor or a son chooses a quiet trade over a noisy boardroom. True joy is never found in the fleeting applause of strangers. It is found in the quiet, unshakable bond shared behind closed doors when the rest of the world fades away. This brings us to the second pillar, which is morality. In the context of raising children, morality is synonymous with pure kindness and unconditional love. Love cannot be a transaction. It cannot depend on whether your child brings you pride, financial convenience, or social leverage. Unconditional affection forms the structural foundation a child requires to navigate a harsh, unforgiving world with a healthy mind. When parents replace empathy with rigid, unyielding judgment, they create an environment dictated by fear. A home should be a safe harbor where a child can share their deepest vulnerabilities and wildest dreams without the looming threat of ridicule or sudden abandonment. Morality also requires a fierce, uncommon type of courage. It requires the bravery to look your child in the eye and admit your own failures. No parent is flawless. We all carry our own damage. Yet the stubborn refusal to apologize is the poison that infects generations. Real morality means confronting your past biases, issuing a sincere apology, and making a tangible effort to repair the broken trust. A genuine admission of guilt does not just lift the heavy burden of unworthiness off the child. It cleanses the parent's own conscience. It provides the only authentic path toward healing. The final pillar is inner strength. It takes profound fortitude to break a generational cycle of trauma. Many parents who inflict pain are simply passing down the same toxic behaviors they endured in their own youth. They hand their children the same heavy burdens they were forced to carry by their own mothers and fathers. Stopping that cycle requires immense willpower. It requires a conscious daily decision to absorb the pain and refuse to transmit it to the next generation. Parenting demands sacrifice, but that sacrifice must be rooted in pure love, rather than a calculated desire for future repayment. When a father views a daughter as a retirement plan, or a mother uses a son as a tool to fulfill her own unmet desires, they cross the line from nurturing to exploiting. We must encourage our children to become self-reliant adults. We must teach them to take ownership of their own lives. This means letting go of the urge to control their every move. We cannot use wealth guilt or positional power as leashes to keep them tethered to our own anxieties. We must allow them to stumble, experience failure, and learn how to stand back up on their own terms. If we apply these principles, we can fundamentally transform our homes. The family stops being a theater of pressure and becomes a sanctuary of peace against the brutal storms of the outside world. By doing so, we contribute to a society that is rich in compassion, ensuring fewer children have to grow up in isolation and pain. If these reflections resonate with the journey you are walking right now, I invite you to join our growing community. Please follow Eva Tells Stories. We share these narratives to shine a light into the dark corners of the human experience, and your presence makes this space so much stronger. I look at the window pane, catching my own reflection in the glass against the dark night sky. We all carry the ghosts of our childhoods. We all harbor the echoes of words spoken to us when we were too small to defend ourselves. You might be the parent trying to undo the mistakes of yesterday, or you might be the child still waiting for an apology that may never arrive. The clock ticks softly on the wall. Tomorrow morning the sun will rise and the world will demand our participation once again. The choice of who we decide to be when we walk out the front door remains ours alone. The script is not finished.